Hi, everybody. I just finished listening to a really interesting podcast, and I think a number of folks who follow me on social media might find it to be interesting as well. It's a really well-known podcast. It's called the Ultimate Health Podcast. It was episode number 552 with Dr. named Dr. Donald Lehman. To my understanding, he's a preeminent researcher in the field of protein biochemistry and the role that protein plays in human physiology as it relates to muscle building and things like that. It was just a really interesting conversation that he had with Jesse Chappus, the gentleman who hosts the Ultimate Health podcast. And the title episode is something to the effect of everything you thought you knew about protein is wrong, or something like that. So of course I had to listen to that episode because I feel like I know quite a lot about protein and maybe I'm wrong. And so it was a really interesting conversation. And I just thought I'd share a couple of the little take-home messages that I got from that episode, and then I encourage anyone interested in this topic at all to consider listening to that. One of the things that was interesting was that Dr. Lehman was and I'm paraphrasing here, and I certainly don't speak for Dr. Lehman. This is just my take-home message that I got from it. If you listen to the episode and get a different take-home message, I'd be curious to hear about that in the comment section below. But one of the things that I understood from the interview was that there may not be as much benefit or importance to following a ketogenic diet, or sorry, a intermittent fasting diet to help promote health span and lifespan, as we may have been led to believe from the animal studies that seem to form the basis of why folks say, oh yeah, follow this type of diet, do the intermittent fasting and whatnot, and that'll lead to just greater longevity, etc. And he, Dr. Lehman does it great justice in the interview. But what I understand is that the animal studies that a lot of those sort of health claims revolve around are related to are not results, rather, that we can necessarily extrapolate to humans, and it has something to do with the nature of mice and rats and things, critters like that. When they're in cages and in a laboratory setting, they have this tendency, when they're just kind of having unfettered access to food, they tend to eat a lot more, they tend to be a lot more sedentary, they tend to become obese really easily. And then once and so their kind of their baseline is that they're really not very healthy, they're quite sedentary and overfed. And then when they introduce then intermittent fasting, or intermittent feeding times, then it's like, oh yeah, there are health benefits, there is life prolongation, because then the mice become less obese and healthier and this and that, because they're not just chowing down all the time. So again, Dr. Lehman speaks about it more eloquently than me, but it was just interesting to hear him speak to that, because in my experience in many sort of the integrative health spheres in the kind of biohacking world, there seems to be this assumption, like, yes, of course, like intermittent fasting, it's kind of a no-brainer. This is something that is seems to be quite irrefutable, that there are these notable health benefits associated with it. Now, when I heard this, I thought, well, that's interesting, and I'm certainly not. I certainly don't recommend intermittent fasting for all of my patients. Some of my patients do it. They seem to feel better when they do it. They have an easier time maintaining a healthier body weight, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's wonderful when it works for folks. It is interesting, just as a clinician, observing that with some of my patients, they seem to really not do well with intermittent fasting, or maybe they don't do poorly with it, but they seem to do better not intermittent fasting. They seem to have better energy, better exercise performance, things like that. So I always chalked it up to, there's no one size fits all, but now I just wonder if there's maybe a bit more to it, that the physiology that we assume is the benefits to health, to our physiology that we assume is related to intermittent fasting, maybe there's a bit more to the story than that. Some of the other interesting aspects of this podcast episode were just around the biochemistry of when we eat protein, for how long afterwards do our bodies go into more of a muscle synthesis mode. And I would say, if you're listening to this and if you're a bodybuilder, probably very interested in this. If you're not a bodybuilder, but you exercise to try to obtain or maintain a healthy muscle mass, I've talked in a few videos more recently about how it's when we have better muscle mass, it's associated with longer lifespan, longer health span. So I think optimizing and maintaining our muscle mass is good, regardless of what our sort of main motivations are. So to my understanding from what Dr. Lehman was saying, there's about a 2-hour window after we eat protein where we're in more of this muscle synthesis mode, and then there's a few hours of a refractory period after that where we're not really in muscle synthesis mode, whether we're eating more protein or not. So what I'm taking from that for my own personal practice, and I already kind of did this anyways based on other things that I had heard and just intuitively what makes sense, but if I'm doing some type of resistance training, lifting weights or anything where I'm hoping to have bigger muscles or stronger muscles as a result of that, then I'm definitely going to want to eat protein, not too long afterwards, to make sure that I'm in that muscle synthesis mode as optimally as possible with my protein intake. Some of the other things Dr. Lehman talked about were the bioavailability and the amino acid profiles of plant-based proteins versus animal-based proteins, and I know there's debate around this topic. I haven't heard a debate between folks who are like essentially saying, vegetable or vegetarian-based protein is, or I should say plant-based protein, is as good or superior to animal-based protein. I've certainly heard folks talking about, I haven't heard a debate where animal-based versus plant-based protein has kind of gone head-to-head, and heard like just a really high-level conversation about that. I've certainly heard some folks who are proponents of animal-based protein say it's superior to plant-based protein. I've heard some proponents of plant-based protein. I don't think I've ever heard them say it's superior to animal protein, but I've heard some arguments that it is equivalent. So I'd really like to hear experts on those topics go head-to-head, compare the research literature and this and that. Haven't heard that to date. But according to Dr. Lehman, again, to my understanding, there seems to be there's due to the amino acid profiles of animal-based proteins, where there is a higher level of essential amino acids, as well as leucine, which is really important for muscle synthesis, that those are higher amounts of that per capita in animal-based protein versus plant-based protein. And so based on what he was saying, it seems that folks who are following a plant-based diet are going to need to eat quite a lot more protein in order to kind of get the equivalent amount of, so quite a bit more plant protein-rich food compared to animal products, which are always high in protein by default, in order to get the same overall net amount of protein. So I'm just kind of pulling some approximate numbers out of the air, but maybe to get the equivalent to say 50 grams of animal protein, maybe one would have to eat like say 70 grams of plant protein, for example, something in that realm. So that's also something that I find to be interesting as a clinician, because I've certainly had some patients who follow a plant-based diet. They seem to do really, really well. They're exercising well. They look like they're in good shape. They're maintaining a healthy body composition. They're doing the activities they want to do, and they feel good. And then I've had other patients where they've tried to go plant-based, and they just haven't done nearly as well on that plant-based diet, so they wind up reverting back to either a mix of protein types, or they just revert to more of a primarily animal-based protein. So I've definitely seen that pattern. I haven't had anyone to date where they found when they went from animal protein to plant protein, they felt that their sports performance, etc., was better. Some people do feel better, in my experience, going on a plant-based diet, although generally when that's happened, they've gone from a not so healthy omnivorous diet to a healthy plant-based diet. So it's like, is it because you're getting rid of the animal proteins, or is it because you're just eating a generally healthier diet, a less inflammatory diet? It's in some of those cases, it's a little bit more ambiguous. There were several other interesting things that Dr. Lehman talked about, but those were just some of the highlights that I wanted to mention. So if you're interested in protein physiology, there are some nice little nuggets in there. I took home, a couple of things, just kind of reinforcing some ideas that I was already working with. But it was a really interesting podcast, and I would recommend it. So again, it's the Ultimate Health Podcast, episode 552, with Dr. Donald Lehman. And if you do wind up listening to it, if you've already listened to it, please consider posting in the comment section, just letting me know and letting all of us know what you thought about the episode, what some of the things from that episode were. There are things that were valuable to you, things that you heard that you don't agree with, and if so, why? It'd be interesting to have a conversation around that. So feel free to post in the comment section below. If you have any questions on this topic or anything else, just post in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer as soon as I can.